Well, happy Saturday. It's time for the weekend video. Get ready. Today I'm going to talk about something else that Jim Richards says in his letter against Mike Williams and the gospel. He's upset that we do not call the New Testament scripture. And throughout his letter, he's mostly addressing what we do, but he broadens his points sometimes to include other universalist things that he's hearing. In this particular case, though, he could probably only be talking about us. Now, there may be somebody else out there who also agrees with us that the New Testament is not scripture and that the Old Testament is, but I'm not aware of who they are, and I'm pretty sure Jim's not aware of that either. So it's us. And specifically, we do call the Old Testament scripture, not the New, for many reasons. Jesus said he came to fulfill the scripture. Now, the scripture at the time that Jesus was alive was what you find in the Old Testament. And he said the scriptures were the law, the Psalms, and the prophets. Now, if you're going to fulfill them, that means you're going to end them, you're going to conclude them. So I can tell you that because we say he did fulfill the scriptures, they were completed, they were ended, they served their purpose, and since Jesus walked this earth, nothing written since then has been scripture. Nothing in the New Testament which was written after that is scripture. They're letters. And they're not very reliable either because they didn't go through the custodial practices under the Jewish law. They had a very strict quality control program. So we never had that for the early manuscripts of the New Testament writings. So not only that, he says that we ignore the teachings of Jesus. We don't ignore the teachings of Jesus. There are parts where Jesus teaches law, he clarifies the law, and he did that mainly because one of the purposes for coming was in Isaiah. It said that he would come to make his law honorable, and he did, because the Pharisees were twisting it, and Jesus basically set it straight. He also spoke very cryptically in parables, but there's a lot of useful things to learn from what Jesus said in those scriptures. And I just said it, sorry, my bad. In the Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then again, they're not very reliable. We know some of them have been tampered with. Like the story, one of my favorite stories is not in any of the earliest manuscripts. It was put in much later, hundreds of years later. And it's the story about the woman that was brought to Jesus in adultery, and he said, "Let him without sin cast the first stone." It's a good story. But that one was never in the originals. It was added by somebody hundreds of years later. So, and there are other things in other books. And then he says, not only do we ignore the teachings of Jesus, only the epistles are valid. Well, we take issue with some of the epistles too. And again, some of them have been tampered with. The epistles from Peter and John and James, they disagree heavily with what Paul preaches as the gospel. And what Paul preaches as the gospel is actually very scholarly and based on scripture. And that's how we determine, based on scripture, what's in the Old Testament. That's how we determine the truth, and where we can validate what Paul is saying with the scriptures, and Peter and James and John disagree with Paul on those issues. we definitely do. We're aware of them. We've read their epistles, but we are aware of the fact that they didn't understand the gospel. And there are a few of epistles that are attributed to Paul that are also highly suspect and have been ever since the 300s when the canonization of the New Testament started. A lot of scholars highly protested a number of letters that were supposedly written by Paul. I do not like the T books because, and I call them the T books. They're the letters that begin with T. Titus, Timothy 1 and 2, and Thessalonians 1 and 2. Those 5 letters, um, there's a lot of discrepancies between them and what Paul says very explicitly in Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, and elsewhere. So you have to scrutinize what you're reading in the New Testament when you're determining what is the gospel truth. And we make no apologies for that. We make no bones about it. He does not like that, though. But in the process, and he says we're picking and choosing which ones we like and don't like. He's actually picking and choosing because he includes them all, but he'll only use a little bit from something that Peter said and a little bit of something that Paul said. But if you read them in context, Peter was disagreeing with Paul, and he somehow marries them together to somehow make them agree. And that is what Christianity does in general. I mean, Jim is not alone in this. He is following that practice, and that is dishonest. And sometimes people aren't even being honest with themselves or conscious of what they're doing when they do things like that. And it's because they revere the whole New Testament as scripture, and therefore they try to make it agree, and it doesn't. It's revolutionary, folks. I know, but have a revolutionary week.